The United States is getting very antsy about Greenland. This sparsely populated but huge country is on the front lines of the Arctic arena, and it has only dogs, albeit cute dogs, pulling dog sleds as defense against Chinese and Russian navies. The United States is trying to take some level of control over the mineral deposits there and establish greater military presence to deter China and Russia. But Greenland is officially part of Denmark, and neither of them is willing to be acquired so fast. This multi-sided negotiation is all over the news. What happened? How should we understand it? People seem to speculate wildly with very little basis except for their political opinions. But there are ways to understand this conflict using science-based frameworks. If you want clarity, insight, and a reusable framework that you can use to understand future international conflicts, you've come to the right place. Hi, I'm Nadav. I'm a professor at INSEAD, one of the top business schools in Europe and Asia, and a pretty good reputation in America. And today I'll explain how to understand multi-sided conflicts using a key theory in conflict resolution. Let's start. So first, let's recap what the IRP framework is. So the IRP stands for Interests, Rights, and Power, and it's a structured approach to sketching out how conflicts play out. These are the three broad avenues that each of the sides can take. So let's go into each of these. So interests, this is when we try to focus on the underlying needs and goals of the other side. So everyone is trying to answer the question, what are you trying to get out of this? And everyone is trying to work to see whether they can address each other's interests while getting their own interests fulfilled. Ideally, this ends with a win-win-win solution if possible, but it's not always possible given the set of interests that we have here in this conflict. Rights is when we rely on who's right based on established standards or rules. So we're basically trying to establish rules about what's fair and what's not fair. And we're trying to get the other side to agree. And you'll see lots of accusations of hypocrisy with this approach.
Telling me I can't invade this country, but then you go and invade this other country?
Basically stuff like that. The last approach is power, and it's just what it sounds like, using coercion or leverage or even military force to impose a solution. This can be threats and ultimatums or even actual military force, as we've seen recently. So immediately we have tools to understand this conflict. So let's use them. So what are the interests of the sides? Let's have a look. So for the United States, they definitely want Arctic security. They want to be secure from the threats of China and Russia, their navies. The definition of Arctic security for the United States, though, is American military, American Navy there, not so much NATO, because there's a lot of distrust by the current administration about the ability of NATO to actually deter threats. The United States also wants access to rare earth minerals, things that make stuff like F-35 jets, which are very advanced fighter jets, guided missiles, radar system, laser targeting, nuclear reactors. These are materials that appear in abundance in Greenland. And finally, the United States wants a sense of legacy and expansion of its influence, if not territory, in the Western Hemisphere. For Greenland, they want Arctic security as well. However, their definition of Arctic security involves both the US and NATO because Greenland trusts the ability of NATO more than the US does. Greenland also wants sovereignty. They want to control their own territory. They want also independence from Denmark. Right now, Denmark controls Greenland in many respects. And finally, Greenland would hope for economic development, being wealthier than they currently are in their remote location. Denmark also wants Arctic security, but like Greenland, they see that as a combination of United States and NATO armies. Denmark definitely wants sovereignty. They do not want the United States to violate its territory in Greenland. And finally, Denmark does not seem to want to give full independence to Greenland. So with this, we can ask, can we have a win-win-win situation with all three countries in the agreement? Maybe, okay? Everyone wants Arctic security, and I don't think Greenland and Denmark would oppose the United States version of that, which is the United States wants its army to be defending the Arctic rather than necessarily NATO, because the United States does not feel like it can trust NATO to do that. So A win-win-win situation would maintain NATO, but also expand military rights for the United States to build additional bases in Greenland. The United States already has a military base in Greenland, but a win-win-win solution would expand those rights to allow more military by the United States to come to Greenland for defense. A win-win-win solution would also involve some sort of agreement that gives the United States the ultimate responsibility for the security of Greenland. In other words, it would leave Greenland internally in charge of itself, and Denmark too, but anything related to external matters, especially military matters, would be given to the United States. There are examples of this. The three Pacific islands of Micronesia, Marshall Islands, and Palau are in a compact of free association, COFA, with the United States, and that means these countries get control internally in their own affairs, but they give the United States control externally in terms of their security. Now here we'll have a twist because this is not going to be just an agreement between the United States and Greenland, but rather between the United States, Greenland, and Denmark, which complicates matters. Both Greenland and Denmark would have to approve of the United States taking charge of their security. One positive sign here is that Denmark is already offering the United States to expand its military presence in Greenland. However, what's missing from this win-win-win solution is consent to develop rare earth materials and extract all of the valuable metals and materials that exist in Greenland. Now, you might ask yourself, in the past few decades, how come Denmark didn't do this already? I mean, Greenland could have done this many years ago, and so did Denmark. However, actually what happened is the opposite. Greenland actually passed a ban on developing uranium, which is a key material in creating nuclear reactors. And this ban was created because of ideological resistance to developing that area from environmental perspective and to maintain the traditional simple lifestyle that people in Greenland have. Moreover, Greenland does not have a lot of funds to undertake the expensive development, the expensive capex that would require to extract all these materials in the harsh weather condition that exists there. Now, we have a few companies already trying to develop some of the materials in Greenland. However, some of these companies have Chinese individuals as shareholders, which likely triggered the United States administration to take action here because they do not want Chinese involvement in very precious rare earth materials that, as we said, are crucial for defense. So could you have a win-win-win situation? Maybe, but Denmark or Greenland would have to budge quite significantly on the issue of rare earth materials. Now let's move on to rights. Now, what are the rights that the different sides are claiming for themselves? Where do they think they have the moral high ground? Well, the United States is saying, look, we pay the lion's share of NATO expenses. We pay for NATO, basically. So we should be able to tell NATO what to do because we're paying for it. Now, on the side of Greenland, they're saying, well, autonomy, our independence is an important moral value, and so is our sovereignty as a national entity. For Denmark, it's also sovereignty, although for Denmark, they are not interested in giving autonomy to Greenland, nor independence. However, they agree with Greenland about the importance of preserving NATO as an independent body rather than as a body that just listens to the United States about everything. Now, the reality with rights is that without agreement between the three parties about the rules of the game, that is what should be considered fair and what should be considered unfair, there will be no rights-based agreement. There's a lot of bluster in the media and in statements by leaders of these countries about moral values and who's right or wrong, but without much substance. There's simply no way to reach an agreement about the rules of the game, and there's no third-party international body with enough credibility to impose them. The United States does not trust the UN or any other international body and feels like it's been paying for NATO for so much and so long that it deserves the support of NATO countries. So a rights-based agreement is highly unlikely. Now, let's talk about power because obviously that's very relevant today. Now, the power of the United States comes from its superior military. It also has an existing military base in Greenland. It has economic power in the ability to reimburse Greenland residents for the right to use the territory to develop resources. The United States also has urgency, and it also has momentum given recent military successes. For Greenland, the one power they have is that they're on the land, and that can cause a lot of trouble to the United States and Denmark because they occupy the land that is being disputed. For Denmark, its power comes from NATO, and it's a very limited power because, again, the United States has been basically funding NATO almost exclusively, or at least a majority share of it, for many, many years. So if you look at the IRP framework, it spells out the conditions that predict use of power by one of the sides. And those conditions are the failure of interest-based negotiations, which is basically what's going on here. We are stalling when we're trying to understand each other's interests and seeing if we can find a win-win-win situation. The second condition is distrust in rights-based approach, and this is definitely right because the United States does not trust the UN, the United Nations, or NATO. Third, there's a significant power asymmetry. One side is much stronger than the other two, and this is exactly what we have here. Fourth, we have high urgency for one of the sides, and this is the United States. And fifth, there's a comfort level of using power. Many, many countries are not comfortable using power, but the current administration is comfortable using power. So this would suggest that the United States will use power to achieve its aims, not necessarily military power, as we'll see, but it will definitely use power to achieve its aims in this context. Okay, so we've done all this analysis. Let's try to figure out what are the outcomes that could happen. Let's rank them based on most probable to least probable. So the most probable outcomes is 1, the United States somehow brings about independence for Greenland, at least independence in important respects. And that allows Greenland to agree to many of the things the United States wants and also be compensated by the United States for this agreement. The second possibility that's probably likely is some sort of diplomatic deal without Greenland being independent. That would require agreements from Denmark to some of the demands the United States is making. The third possibility is that Denmark and Greenland run out the clock on the United States. Remember, the current administration only has 3 years to go before the next election, and that could change things quite a bit. And so it's possible that we engage in this back and forth for several years, and the clock just runs out. Now, the unlikely possibilities are the following. First, the United States backing down. It's unlikely this would happen given the power asymmetries and given the stated goals and behavior of the current American administration. Another unlikely outcome is a full-scale invasion into Greenland, and we'll talk about why that is. And finally, another extremely unlikely outcome is some sort of international mediation or arbitration between the United States and Denmark and Greenland, and we'll talk about why that is very unlikely. Okay, so let's start with the likely possibilities. So the first possibility that I think is relatively likely is that there's going to be some sort of economic coercion and incentives, basically a soft power play by the United States. So the United States would offer a very generous payment on a recurring basis to residents of Greenland, or perhaps or sanctions for Denmark. So that would push secession or independence, a vote by Greenland residents to secede from Denmark and favoring ties with the United States. That would make Greenland independent in one way or another. Maybe it would become one of those compact of free association countries that we said, or maybe just completely independent. And so Greenland would handle their own internal affairs and the United States would handle all security. Now, the one twist here is that the United States would insist that US companies will be given easements and permissions to mine rare earth materials because that is a very key interest of the United States. Now, in that situation, NATO countries would howl and cry wolf, but they are unlikely to take any action about it because, again, the United States is basically funding NATO and is the key member. There will be some ill feelings after such a solution, but it's a possibility. Now, the second possibility is some sort of diplomatic deal, this time between all three sides. And in that situation, the United States would accept Denmark's offer to expand military presence in Greenland. The United States would then establish mining partnerships using American companies, and here both Denmark and Greenland would have to cave to some extent. And then Greenland would have to give up its ban on mining uranium, but in return they'll get infrastructure and economic aid, and they would avoid losing sovereignty. Now, the United States would give up their interest of creating a legacy and expanding its territory for the privilege of mining rare earth materials and establishing military presence in the Arctic. It's very possible this would happen, but my guess is the United States will go for this only if better solutions don't work. The third likely possibility is that Denmark and Greenland run out the clock on the Trump presidency, which only has 3 years to go, and in reality, perhaps even only 2 years, because it's possible that in the last year of the presidency, he will be a lame duck. The next president of the United States is unknown, and it's unclear if that person would have the same interest as the current president. So this would keep the situation at a stalemate. Now, the United States has much more urgency than Denmark or Greenland. And so the United States will take action to pressure those two countries, either from within by offering residents of Greenland payouts and pushing for a referendum vote to gain independence, or the United States would pressure from without by doing economic sanctions to restrict Denmark and Greenland. Now let's move on to the unlikely option. So unlikely option is military escalation and invasion. I mean, the biggest obstacle there is not so much what Greenland would do. I mean, again, they only have a few dogs and dog sleds, but rather the US Congress, the administration would face incredible internal chaos and conflict because a lot of people in the United States don't support an invasion into what is a friendly country. Moreover, although it's not hard to conquer Greenland, it's hard to occupy it, and the people who live in Greenland would cause a lot of trouble because they don't want to be occupied by the United States. Moreover, there'll be a crisis in NATO that even the United States couldn't avoid because all the NATO countries would be up in arms about it. So for those reasons, I don't think it's likely the United States would actually invade. However, it's very helpful for the United States that this is even on the table, even if the perception that it's possible for the United States to invade makes Denmark more flexible in negotiating. Another unlikely solution is the United States backing down, okay? It's unlikely that the EU or NATO would pressure the United States quite enough for the United States to back down. There's just not enough power that comes from countries like France or Germany or the UK. Moreover, the United States Congress could potentially limit the administration by forcing Trump to declare war and to vote on the possibility of war, but that would simply remove the military option off the table, which wasn't likely anyway. The reality is that it's very hard for Denmark and Greenland to get the United States to back down at this point. Now, one caveat to this is if Democrats win big in the United States election in 2026, that could slow down the United States administration. However, even then, again, the administration in the United States does not need congressional approval to sign agreements with these different countries. Now, the last very unlikely possibility is some sort of international mediation between the three sides. There is very little trust from the United States into organizations that it's funding. So the United States does not trust the UN and does not trust NATO. It's not that the United States is not an ally of NATO, but the feeling currently is that NATO allies are not contributing their fair share. And when push comes to shove, NATO will not be there. And again, the United States will be the one who has to provide the bulk of the defense. So there isn't really any kind of credibility for international organizations vis-a-vis the United States to produce any kind of outcome. So there you have it. We've mapped out the possibilities of how this conflict can end in a way that's much more efficient, interesting, and accurate than whatever you read in the news media. Moreover, you can use this framework, IRP, to analyze many, many conflicts out there in the international arena. So what I want you to do now is, having listened to this video, vote in the comments which one of the 6 possibilities that we went through is the most likely and you think will happen. And we'll do a little poll and see who's right at the end.